Picture yourself standing on the shores of the Black Sea, where gentle waves lap against ancient stone walls, and the air carries the faint scent of salt and thyme. Here, in the coastal towns of the Byzantine Empire, an age-old dance between sea and sun created one of civilization's most precious commodities: salt. For over 1,000 years, from Constantinople to the furthest reaches of Anatolia, Byzantine families relied on this crystalline treasure to preserve their food and sustain their communities through the changing seasons. The empire's relationship with salt began at its very edges, where the sea met the land in perfect harmony. Along the Black Sea coast, in places like Mesembria and Cherson, shallow evaporation ponds stretched like mirrors under the Mediterranean sun. Imagine these tranquil pools, carefully constructed with low stone walls, where seawater slowly concentrated under the gentle warmth of summer days. The workers who tended these ponds moved with quiet purpose, raking the forming crystals with wooden tools, their movements as rhythmic as the tides themselves. These coastal salt works were marvels of patient engineering. Picture the methodical way Byzantine salt makers would flood their shallow basins during the spring months, then watch as the sun and wind work their ancient magic. The water would gradually evaporate, leaving behind increasingly concentrated brine that shimmered in the afternoon light. By late summer, perfect pyramids of white salt would form, ready to be harvested grain by precious grain. The quality of salt varied wonderfully across the empire's vast territories. Sea salt from the Aegean shores possessed a fine, almost powdery texture that dissolved easily, making it perfect for delicate preservation work. Meanwhile, the salt from Black Sea ponds had larger, more robust crystals that could withstand the rigors of heavy-duty preservation. Each region developed its own preferences, its own subtle understanding of which salt worked best for which purpose. Now imagine following these precious cargo loads as they made their way inland, carried on the backs of sure-footed mules along winding mountain paths, or loaded onto sturdy carts that creaked gently along the empire's well-maintained roads. The salt trade created invisible threads that connected the empire's furthest reaches, from the salt pans of coastal cities to the highland villages where families eagerly awaited their annual supply. In Anatolia's interior, where the sea was just a distant memory, Byzantine communities discovered another gift from the earth itself. Here, ancient geological forces had left deposits of rock salt buried in mountainsides, waiting to be carefully extracted. Picture miners working by lamplight in these cool, quiet tunnels, chipping away at veins of crystalline salt that had formed millions of years before the first Byzantine emperor ever drew breath. This rock salt had its own character, harder, more angular, with a slightly different taste that local cooks learned to appreciate and use to their advantage. Once the salt reached Byzantine homes, it entered a world of careful storage and thoughtful preservation. Picture a typical household storage room, cool and dim, where large ceramic vessels, called pithoi, stood like silent guardians. These magnificent containers, some as tall as a person, were specifically designed to protect their precious contents from moisture and contamination. Their thick walls kept the salt dry, even during the humid summer months, while the narrow necks could be sealed with wax and cloth to create an almost airtight environment. Wealthier households might store their salt in wooden chests lined with thin sheets of lead, a luxury that provided even better protection against moisture. Imagine opening one of these chests and finding not just salt, but salt that had been carefully layered with aromatic herbs. Sprigs of wild thyme from the hillsides, or oregano that filled the storage room with its gentle, earthy fragrance. These herbs didn't just add pleasant scents. They helped maintain the salt's quality and prevented the growth of any unwanted organisms. The Byzantine approach to food preservation followed the natural rhythms of the seasons, with a wisdom that modern life has largely forgotten. As autumn painted the hillsides in shades of gold and crimson, fishing communities along the empire's extensive coastlines prepared for one of their busiest times of the year. Schools of mackerel and sardines would arrive in vast numbers, their silver bodies flashing just beneath the surface of the calm waters. Picture the quiet efficiency of a Byzantine fishing village during these autumn days. Fishermen would set out before dawn in their sturdy boats, returning with holds full of gleaming fish just as the morning sun began to warm the harbor. But the real work began on shore, where families had prepared wooden barrels and ceramic containers, along with carefully measured amounts of coarse salt. The preservation process required a delicate balance. Too little salt, and the fish would spoil. Too much, and they would become impossibly salty and tough. The traditional ratio, passed down through generations of coastal families, called for approximately 1 part salt to 4 parts fish by weight. But this wasn't simply a matter of mixing the two together. Instead, imagine the methodical layering process. First, a generous bed of salt in the bottom of a barrel, then a layer of fish arranged so they wouldn't touch each other, then more salt, then more fish, building up like sedimentary layers of sustenance that would last through the winter months. The art lay in the details that made the difference between success and failure. The salt had to be coarse enough to allow air circulation, yet fine enough to penetrate the fish flesh effectively. The fish needed to be absolutely fresh, their eyes still clear and their scales still bright. And the containers themselves required careful preparation, scrubbed clean and sometimes rubbed with aromatic herbs to prevent any off flavors from developing. As the layers built up in each barrel, the salt began its ancient work of drawing moisture from the fish, creating a brine that would protect and preserve the catch for months to come. Picture these barrels stored in cool cellars or partially buried in the earth, where the temperature remained constant and the fish could undergo their slow transformation from fresh catch to preserved sustenance. When it came to preserving meat, Byzantine households developed techniques that were both practical and surprisingly sophisticated. Pork, being the most commonly preserved meat, required special attention during the cooler months when the risk of spoilage was lowest. Picture a Byzantine family preparing for this important task as the first crisp days of autumn arrived, when the air carried just enough chill to make meat preservation both possible and safe. The process began with careful selection of the finest cuts, followed by a 2-stage preservation method that had been refined over centuries. First came the initial heavy salting, where cuts of pork were completely buried in coarse salt, like precious artifacts being carefully preserved for future discovery. This stage typically lasted 10 to 15 days, during which the salt drew out moisture and began the crucial process of creating an environment where harmful bacteria simply could not survive. Imagine the family checking on their buried meat every few days, noting how the salt had begun to form a protective crust, how the color had deepened and changed. After this initial salting period, the meat would be carefully brushed clean and hung in cool, well-ventilated spaces. Perhaps in a north-facing room, where the sun never directly penetrated, or in specially constructed drying chambers, where the air could circulate freely around each hanging piece. The timing of meat preservation was crucial, typically completed before the depths of winter, when temperatures could become unpredictable. Byzantine families developed an intuitive understanding of weather patterns, knowing exactly when conditions were perfect for each stage of the preservation process. Too warm, and the meat might spoil before the salt could do its work. Too cold, and the process would slow to an ineffective crawl. Turning to the preservation of vegetables, we find perhaps some of the most ingenious techniques developed by Byzantine households. Picture a family garden in late summer, heavy with cabbages, turnips, and other vegetables that needed to be preserved before the first frost. The process of salt brining vegetables was both an art and a science, requiring careful attention to ratios, timing, and storage conditions. Cabbage, one of the most important preserved vegetables, underwent a transformation that would be familiar to anyone who has made modern sauerkraut. Imagine Byzantine cooks shredding fresh cabbage leaves with sharp knives, then layering them with salt in large ceramic vessels. The salt would immediately begin drawing moisture from the vegetable, creating its own preservation brine. The key was achieving the right balance. Enough salt to prevent spoilage, but not so much that the final product became unpalatably salty. The storage vessels themselves were marvels of practical design. Picture large, wide-mouthed ceramic containers, specially made with fitted wooden lids that could be weighted down with smooth stones. This weighting was essential, keeping the vegetables submerged beneath their protective brine, where air could not reach them and cause spoilage. The sight of these preservation vessels, lined up in cool storage areas, represented security and sustenance for the months ahead. Olives required their own special treatment, as their natural bitterness needed to be carefully managed during preservation. Byzantine families developed techniques for salt-curing olives that enhanced their natural flavors while ensuring they would last through the winter months. Picture the careful process of selecting only the finest olives, then layering them with coarse salt in ways that allowed the brine to penetrate evenly throughout the batch. Cheesemaking in the Byzantine world represented another fascinating application of salt preservation techniques. Different types of cheese required different approaches, and Byzantine households became remarkably skilled at matching the right salt to the right cheesemaking process. For fresh cheeses, which were consumed relatively quickly, fine-grained salt that dissolved easily was preferred. This salt integrated smoothly into the cheese, providing preservation without overwhelming the delicate flavors that fresh cheese was prized for. Hard cheeses, destined for aging in cool cellars or natural caves, required a different approach entirely. Picture the process of making these long-lasting cheeses, where coarser salt was used both in the cheese itself and as part of the aging process. The salt not only preserved the cheese, but also contributed to the development of complex flavors that would emerge over months of careful aging. The aging environments themselves were carefully chosen and prepared. Imagine natural caves or specially constructed cellars, where the temperature remained constant year-round, and where the humidity could be controlled through careful ventilation. These spaces often featured stone shelves where wheels of cheese could age undisturbed, turning occasionally to ensure even development, protected by their salt-enhanced rinds from the outside world. Byzantine monasteries elevated food preservation to an almost spiritual practice, combining practical necessity with religious devotion to create some of the most systematic approaches to preservation in the medieval world. Picture the monastery of Mount Athos, perched on its rocky peninsula, where monks developed detailed records and schedules for their preservation activities. These communities, often isolated for months at a time, needed to be completely self-sufficient in their food production and preservation. The monastic approach to preservation was characterized by careful planning and meticulous record-keeping. Imagine monastery ledgers that tracked salt allocation with mathematical precision, showing that each monk required approximately 2 to 3 pounds of salt annually, just for food preservation purposes. This might seem like a small amount by modern standards, but it represents careful calculation based on the monastery's needs for preserved fish, vegetables, dairy products, and occasional meat. Monastic communities also developed preservation schedules that coordinated with the agricultural and religious calendars. Picture monks working in harmony during the harvest seasons, some preparing vegetables for salt brining, while others tended to the fish preservation or cheese aging processes. These activities were often accompanied by prayer or religious contemplation, making the preservation of food not just a practical necessity, but a form of spiritual practice. The scale of monastic preservation operations was impressive. Large monasteries might preserve hundreds of pounds of fish during a single autumn season, or prepare enough preserved vegetables to sustain the entire community through the winter months. Yet despite the large scale, the attention to detail remained meticulous, with experienced monks passing down their knowledge to younger members through hands-on training and careful observation. As we explore the regional variations in Byzantine preservation techniques, we discover how local conditions and available resources shaped different approaches to the same basic challenges. In coastal regions, where sea salt was abundant and fresh fish was plentiful, preservation techniques focused on making the most of seasonal abundance. Picture a coastal Byzantine town where every household had its own version of fish preservation, with subtle variations passed down through family lines. Inland communities developed their own specializations based on what was available to them. In areas near rock salt deposits, families learned to work with harder, more mineral-rich salt that required different handling techniques. This salt might be ground to different consistencies for different purposes, or combined with local herbs and spices that grew wild in the surrounding countryside. Mountain communities often developed the most innovative preservation techniques, as they had to make their supplies last through long, isolated winters. Picture Byzantine families in these highland regions carefully calculating their preservation needs months in advance, knowing that once winter snow blocked the mountain passes, they would be completely dependent on their preserved foods until spring returned. The influence of local climate also created fascinating variations in preservation techniques. In the humid coastal regions, families developed methods to combat moisture and prevent their preserved foods from absorbing too much water from the air. This might involve special storage techniques, the use of additional drying agents, or timing preservation activities to coincide with drier weather patterns. Drier inland regions presented different challenges, where the main concern was often preventing preserved foods from becoming too desiccated. Here, Byzantine families developed techniques for maintaining just the right amount of moisture in their preserved foods, using sealed storage containers and careful monitoring to ensure their provisions remained palatable throughout the storage period. The sophistication of Byzantine preservation techniques becomes even more apparent when we consider how they manage the complex logistics of feeding an entire empire. Picture the supply chains that connected salt production centers with population centers. The careful planning required to ensure that every community had adequate salt supplies before the preservation seasons began, and the knowledge systems that allowed successful techniques to spread from region to region. Traders who specialized in salt developed remarkable expertise in matching different types of salt to different preservation needs. They could recommend the finest sea salt for delicate cheese-making, coarser salt for heavy-duty fish preservation, or the specific rock salt varieties that worked best for particular types of meat curing. This specialized knowledge was as valuable as the salt itself, representing generations of accumulated wisdom about the subtle art of preservation. The economic importance of salt preservation techniques extended far beyond individual households. Picture the strategic thinking of Byzantine administrators who had to ensure that military forces, urban populations, and isolated communities all had access to adequate preservation materials. The empire's ability to maintain consistent food supplies through preservation was directly connected to its political and military stability. As our journey through Byzantine salt preservation draws to a close, we can appreciate the remarkable sophistication of these ancient techniques. From the sun-drenched salt pans of coastal cities to the careful preservation work in mountain monasteries, Byzantine communities developed a comprehensive understanding of how to use salt to transform perishable foods into lasting sustenance. Their methods combined practical knowledge gained through generations of experience with careful observation of natural processes and seasonal rhythms. These preservation techniques represent more than just practical skills. They embody a deep understanding of the natural world and humanity's place within it. Byzantine families who mastered these arts possessed a form of security that modern life, with its complex supply chains and refrigerated storage, has made us forget. They knew how to take abundance from one season and transform it into sustenance for the next, creating a buffer against uncertainty that was both practical and deeply satisfying. The legacy of Byzantine preservation techniques continued long after the empire itself had passed into history. Many of their methods influenced later preservation practices throughout Europe and beyond, creating chains of knowledge that connect ancient salt pans to modern kitchens. In this gentle mastery of salt and time, we find a reminder